Good afternoon, and welcome to the Rumi Forum Luncheon Series. Today we have Paul Heck with us. He is a professor at Georgetown University's Theology Department since 2004. He received his doctorate in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago. He is author of The Construction of Knowledge in Islamic Civilization and Common Ground, Islam, Christianity, and Religious Pluralism, and is editor of The Politics of Sufism, The Power of Spirituality. He was a member of Princeton's University Society of Fellows in the Humanities and held the Toohey Chair in Interreligious Studies at John Carroll University. And he taught at the Mohammed University as a Fulbright Scholar, Senior Scholar in 2008-2009, very recently. And today Paul is going to speak with us about his book, Common Ground, Islam, Christianity, and Religious Pluralism. And I'd like to read a quote from Marcia Hermanson from Loyola University. She says, "Tackling issues such as justice, democracy, human rights, and competing truth claims, Heck's lucid, sympathetic, and historically informed reflections open new vistas in interfaith dialogue, while engaging and informing his readers about a dynamic Muslim world facing many of the same challenges as the contemporary West." So,
great.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Jenna and Imre for inviting me here, the Rumi Forum, for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you. It's a great privilege. So first of all, why did I write this book? Aren't there enough books out there trying to convince Muslims and Christians to get along? So I guess I'm not going to get into all the details of the book, but just to kind of dwell on the main idea. It's basically a way of knowing is what I'm trying to demonstrate, a way of knowing. So while my book does fit into the Interreligious Dialogue project, it's really a scholarly project that I'm trying to kind of get my hands on. A way of knowing in the sense of knowledge showing us how bound up we are with one another. Now, clearly that's all peoples, but in my case, I'm talking about Muslims and Christians. I'm not wanting to exclude anyone. And so what I'm trying to say is that faith is not simply a sentiment or an identity. Often today we think of religion as an identity. There's some truth to that, but I think it can also limit us in our understanding of how religion is at work in our lives as individuals and communities. There's some knowledge content to religion. It's not just a feeling. I think the pervading sentiment that religion is kind of my private world, it goes back to some developments in 19th, 20th century university life that wanted to kind of marginalize religion as a real phenomenon in the world, and I can get into that later, but that's where we are. Yes, of course, religion is a subjective experience in many ways, but it's one that can be put into words, and so therefore it can be objective in this way. And therefore, the face of God, for example, to take a theme or a concept that's prevalent in both Islam and Christianity, is not something that one community or another kind of owns as their particular sentiment, but it's actually something we can talk about. We can talk about the face of God as we talk about any object of knowledge. So let me just put this in perspectives by making a couple points. First, something that I call the blame game remains strong. In some circles I frequent, you hear people saying, "What's wrong with the Muslim community? Why aren't they doing more to condemn destructive ideas and actions that go by the name of Islam?" And in other circles I frequent, I hear people saying, "What's wrong with the American people? Why do they allow their government to ride roughshod over one Muslim society or another?" This is the blame game. The idea that a particular culture or people or religion or nation is to blame for the world's problems. At a deeper level, it also assumes that we have nothing to discuss together, whether we're part of a culture or a religion or a nation. It's simply one identity or another. Again, the idea of identity, almost as if we're separate species. As a result, because of that way of thinking, I believe, the blame ends up being pointed towards one group or another rather than all of us kind of realizing that there are larger principles that we all respond to or fail to respond to. So let me say this. Islam is a positive presence in the world. The United States is a positive presence in the world. Christianity is a positive presence in the world. Arab society and Turkish society and Iranian society and French society, all these cultures are a positive presence in the world. If we stop for a moment and think about the values that each of these groups, religions, cultures, so on, promote, I think we'll see that none of them are a negative presence in the world. There are serious problems in the world that concern all of us. But if all these groups, religions, cultures are basically positive presences at heart, why do tensions persist between communities, between different communities? Why does the blame game continue? One reason, I think, is a kind of a lag time. Realities have changed so much in the last decades. Globalization, bringing different peoples, cultures, religions into sustained contact in unprecedented fashion. The problem, I think, is that knowledge has not caught up to speed, as it were. Or even if we have the knowledge of different kinds of peoples and cultures, we still don't quite know how to deploy it in a life-giving fashion. And I think this will continue, especially when it comes to religion, because sometimes we assume it's solely private in nature. And yes, religion is an individual choice, to be sure, but it's something more than that. But I think because of this, the assumptions we sometimes have around the very concept of religion, either a private kind of experience or a political tool to mobilize the masses, I think we fail to realize how we can discuss it as a body of knowledge. You know, and in the end, you know, you hear people saying, well, oh, you're entitled to your opinion and I'm entitled to mine. Well, yes, but there are discussions to be had. So, what I'm saying is that different communities, Muslims and Christians in the case I'm addressing, they need help in seeing how they can have a common conversation. For that, a basis of knowledge is needed, or bases of knowledge, not simply knowledge in the sense of a bunch of facts. Okay, here are the pillars of Islam, you know. But rather knowledge that helps individuals and communities discuss common concerns, questions, and aspirations together out of their own religious experiences, that are not quirky or ineffable, as 19th, 20th century contemporary scholars would want us to believe, but have a reality that can be communicated to others. So we need to imagine how knowledge can work beyond facts and definitions and actually help us be in a life-giving relation with one another. I think we have the will to love, we have the courage to love, but I'm suggesting in this book and in the work that I do in general that we also need the knowledge to love. And this brings me to my second point. The idea that the scholarly enterprise, universities, exists to help people enter into life-giving relations would most likely be received with some puzzlement in the modern university. The knowledge to love, that concept doesn't exist in the dominant intellectual circles today. That idea isn't there, which is strange. So, you know, for many reasons, some of them good, scholars see themselves as neutral observers, above the fray, independent. And there's a truth to that, but it also has its problems, because I think we forget what the purpose of knowledge is. The things we research and teach become interesting curiosities rather than possibilities for life-giving relations between peoples. The knowledge to love. And this is ironically true when it comes to the study of religions today. Since religion is held to have no empirical reality, it's not something that should have impact on the world. And yet it does. It has tremendous impact on the world, and sometimes in irrational ways. And part of the reason for this, I believe, is that there's been a faith-knowledge disconnect that can leave believers, or some believers, thinking of their religious experience as an unknowable private identity that can't be communicated in rational categories. And so what I'm saying is that keeping this idea of religion out of the academy, out of the modern university, because people in the modern university are a little bit hesitant to think about religion in this way, something that can be discussed as a body of knowledge in a serious way, I think because they've kind of kept that out, that's led to this faith-knowledge disconnect. And so as a result, part of the irrationalization of religion, I think, can be partly put at the feet of the modern university. And so, to connect the dots, we live in a global moment where communities, Muslims and Christians, are in need of knowledge that is not simply knowledge in a conventional sense, but knowledge that allows them to see how it is precisely because of their religious experiences that they are caught up with one another in profound ways. Because again, religious experience is something that is not simply a private sentiment, but has knowledge content, even if we sometimes don't come to common answers. And yet, on the other side, while there's this great need for this kind of knowledge, on the other side, the purveyors of knowledge today aren't thinking this way. So, I'm hoping my book is a step in that direction, a book that does not simply look at two religions alongside one another, kind of state the facts of this religion and that one, as if to compare and contrast and see where one has it right and one has it wrong. Rather, I'm attempting to think about two religions through a single lens of questions, theological, ethical, political, even if the lens is at times refracted. Right? That's fine if knowledge has a certain kind of refractiveness to it. Knowledge doesn't necessarily have to be uniform, although there is a unity to knowledge. And that's another issue as we kind of today in the modern university get caught in our own little disciplines. We forget how knowledge is connected, even knowledge related to a single field, such as the study of religion. So what I'm saying is we all want a life-giving relation. That's all, I think we all want that. But to get there, we'll need to get beyond the idea of religion as particular identity. We need a concept of religious knowledge that, again, is not just facts and definitions and identities, but shows us how we can think of our religious experiences, which are subjective, in terms of broader categories of truth that we all aspire to. And so let me just mention here two examples that have some relevancy to make it a little more concrete. Every year at Georgetown, I teach Introduction to Islam. Some Muslims take the course, but it's mainly non-Muslims of one stripe or another. If the course takes place in the fall, I give the students an interview assignment over the Thanksgiving break. They have to find a local Muslim leader in their area and interview him or her with questions coming from our semester study of Islam. In general, this is an effective opportunity for what I call knowing in active relation. Knowing in active relation. So it wouldn't be enough if these students simply had a chat with a Muslim figure without having acquired some knowledge of Islam in advance, just as the purpose of the knowledge they had been acquiring over the semester would not have clicked. The purpose of the knowledge they had been acquiring would have not have clicked if they had simply studied Islam in the classroom without the experience of speaking with a Muslim leader. A very striking example of this happened just last semester when a student came to me after his interview and shared with me how it had been the most profound moment of his life. What should this say to us when a young Christian is awakened to something about himself and about the truth of life as a result of a knowledge encounter with a Muslim? The conversation he related threw him off guard. First, because he had never had a conversation with a Muslim in this way. And more significantly, and here's the point, more significantly, he saw, perhaps for the first time, how directly knowledge and life-giving relations go together as the true purpose of knowledge. He wasn't about to run off and become a Muslim, nor was that Muslim leader about to become a Christian. But there was something there where they both realized how deeply caught up they are with one another. And not in some type of fuzzy-dovey, sentimental way, but a knowledge-based way. Now, I certainly don't have a monopoly on this type of teaching, but it should make us pause and ask what the purpose of knowledge is today, especially the study of religion in the modern university. This student, his experience offered him a fuller knowledge of Islam that simply studying it as an interesting curiosity in the classroom would have failed to give him. In that sense, the university has a lesson to learn. That knowledge that is not based on the idea of being in active relation invariably fails when it comes to the delivery of full knowledge itself. The second example, very quickly, I hope I'm doing okay on time.
I was going to ask you to repeat that, actually.
Oh,
that line.
The last sentence, okay. So, the idea that the university has a lesson to learn, right? We think we know what knowledge is, and yet concepts of knowledge always change. And I'd like to think that this globalizing moment is helping us move to a cusp of new understandings of knowledge. And so, on the basis of the little example that I just gave, the idea is that knowledge that is not based on the idea of being in active relation with the object of study, it invariably comes up short in terms of what knowledge is itself, right? If you just stay in the university, in the ivory tower, you're going to miss it. Not that the ivory tower is somehow a problem, but it sometimes kind of pulls the wagons around and therefore, I think, misses the fullness of knowledge. The second example comes from my teaching experience the past year in Morocco, teaching courses on Christianity to Muslim students, indeed highly pious Muslim students. The circles these students move in promote a rather distorted picture of Christianity. This might be due in part to the fact that there are no Christians in Morocco, so you just don't have a first-hand experience of them, right? So they're kind of some strange creature in other lands. For almost all my students the past year, I was the first Christian they had encountered. Over the course of the year, we had a series of extraordinary conversations in class and out. I won't go into all the details, but simply make a single point. There, I presented Christianity, as I do Islam here, as a venture very concerned about questions of truth, about God and God's way of working in the world. And in a way that can be communicated, again, in this knowledge-based, recognizable fashion. Okay, not just as people's feelings. And so this ran counter to previous versions of Christianity they had learned that had defined it essentially as a kind of paganism, and therefore a religious identity with nothing to say to Islam and Muslims. But, and here's the point, the experience did not threaten them, nor did it raise anxieties about Islam being the sole claimant to truth, right? The identity question. Quite the opposite. For these students in Morocco, it was a kind of relief to know that Christians also take truth very seriously and think deeply about what a life for God means. They were, in fact, happy to know that they could join with Christians in, to some extent, a common venture, a life lived for God. They were happy to know that I was not their enemy, but their friend, somehow, again, caught up with them inextricably in the deeper moments, in the deeper movements at work in the world. Therefore, first of all, what I'm talking about does not distract from the highest standards of critical scholarship, okay? It feeds into dialogue and all of that, but my project is a scholarly project, and I would say that it does not at all, some of the people, my colleagues, have concerns that this type of thing, knowing an active relation, is going to kind of undermine the critical distance that we need to be true scholars. And so what I'm saying is, it does not distract from the highest standards of critical scholarship, but actually enhances them. And secondly, what I'm suggesting is that this concept of knowledge benefits the human spirit, helping us overcome fears about others so that we might see, on the basis of real knowledge, that our deeper desire is actually to share our lives together. And this is what I believe my book is moving towards. I've got other projects already. I've forgotten, in fact, what I wrote in this book. I'm moving on now, but that is the kind of first step in this direction. And the book, just quickly, ranges over a number of issues, from beliefs about Jesus to the real doubts we all sometimes have over elements within our respective religious traditions, to ways to live a faith-based ethics in a highly pluralistic world, to the way we think about violence and religion, to concerns about good governance, and finally, to questions about human rights. If anyone has any comments or concerns or questions about that, maybe we can leave it to the discussion. I've tried to kind of amass a good deal of knowledge. The book is kind of crammed through with all sorts of ideas that come from the Muslim and Christian perspectives on those questions. So, just to kind of make my last point here, the common ground I'm talking about, it's not about getting Christians and Muslims to line up in their specific beliefs, somehow cramming two religions into a single box. That simply won't happen. The common ground here is rather about a common conversation that might not lead always to common conclusions, but does show us how real knowledge of one another is not simply a checklist of definitions, but actually can bind us together more deeply. The book, then, is a way to offer hints, insights into how the religious experience, again, not just facts and definitions, but the religious experience of Muslims and Christians are not simply sentimental, emotion-based, but quite real, and therefore a reality to share. This won't put an end to the difficult issues of the day in which religion is sometimes implicated, but I do believe it would help put an end to this blame game. And I, for one, think that's a project worth pursuing. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. All right. I think many of you have questions. You've been very patient. So we'll open it up to the floor. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation today. I think that it would help maybe if you could remark a little bit about the Islamic contribution to knowledge in the context of ilm versus ma'rifah, something similar to gnosis that we in the West understand with small g. That might help give a more comprehensive understanding of what knowledge is.
Sure.
In a way that makes good sense.
Yes, knowledge obviously is vast. And so what this gentleman is referring to is certain concepts of knowledge within the Muslim tradition. And so while I kind of presented my ideas as kind of moving forward, as it were, kind of trying to find a new conceptualization of knowledge that makes sense today and is effective, in fact, some of the things I said are rooted in traditions that are ancient on both the Muslim and Christian side. So ilm comes very much from the Quran itself, the idea that there's a certain knowledge about God that's revealed and is therefore real, okay? And Muslims have taken that concept in different directions. Certainly there's the idea of knowledge that guides us in our day-to-day life. This often gets called Sharia, a way of life that has had a certain flexibility over the centuries as Muslims figure out what's the right thing to do, what's the good society, what's the knowledge that will guide us. Life is not just about pursuing interests. as if some invisible hand is going to guide us to a greater good. We've realized that. This economic crisis shows us that in fact, oh, I working as hard as I can to make as much money, and he working and she working as hard as they can to make as much money, isn't going to lead to the common good. We need knowledge. We need knowledge more than just interests. And that is a very ancient idea in Islam, the idea that we need knowledge to guide society to the good, and we need to think about it very seriously. And then another way Muslims have taken the concept of knowledge is this term of gnosis or marifa, spiritual knowledge, and perhaps that might be a little bit more relevant to what I was talking about today. I mean, you know, we live in a moment where subjectivity is kind of prevailing paradigm, and so we have these experiences of God. Believers, even people who aren't theists in their way, have deeply subjective experiences. Spiritual experiences that are subjective, and yet that doesn't mean those experiences can't be communicated to one another. And this goes back to the idea of knowledge in Sufism, especially that branch of Islam. And if you go back and if you look at the mystics, as they're often referred to, whether in Islam or Christianity or Judaism, they often talked about the ineffability of God. Okay? Well, that would seem to be counter to what I'm saying. Ineffable means you can't communicate it. It's just something I can know. It's just my identity, it's my experience, nothing of relevance to others, nor theirs to mine. Well, in fact, if you read some of the scholars, late 19th, early 20th century, they were trying to kind of bring into play a modernizing agenda, which wasn't wrong, which was driven by healthy impulses at the time, but I think they overstepped the question. People like William James, building upon Friedrich Schleiermacher, they went back and they read this idea of ineffable. What the mystics were saying, whether the Sufis of Islam or the Christian mystics, they were saying that that what's ineffable is God. God is always beyond human description. They weren't saying, though, that their own mystical experiences were not possible to communicate. Okay? They weren't saying that their own experiences were ineffable, that they couldn't communicate them in some type of recognizable language. They were saying God is ineffable. Okay? So some of the things I'm saying are trying to not run around what's happened over the last century or two in terms of understanding gnosis, but to kind of appreciate some of the things that got overlooked as we moved into a modern period that's been very good in many ways. It's given us, so many more opportunities and health standards and democracy and things like this. Good things, but I think religion got a little bit maltreated, as it were, particularly on the question of knowledge, right? Because they were trying to show that, well, religion is just something impossible to know. Well, yeah, God, in a way, is always ineffable, but there is some type of knowledge here, even in our subjective experiences, that then get communicated objectively in language. If that kind of responds a little bit to what you were saying, it's a wonderful tradition, and I'm teaching a graduate seminar this semester on Muslim and Christian mysticism.
Yes, Father Massa.
Yes. So I'm James Wiseman from Catholic U. If I'm not mistaken, the first two words of the title of your book, Common Ground, are also the name of an initiative that's been going on for some months with leaders of the two faith traditions. I think at one point they even met at Georgetown. Could you say a little bit about where that whole initiative stands these days?
Okay, yeah. I think that the exact name of that initiative is Common Word. Okay. But yeah, I certainly do mention it in the opening paragraph of my book, that I'm trying to show that, look, scholars need to kind of take this more seriously. Now, I haven't been involved in that myself, so I can't speak authoritatively. It certainly generated a lot of interest. Religious leaders and political leaders, I mean, the King of Saudi Arabia last year at the UN, or now it's, I guess, 2 years ago, November, I think, of 2008, or, you know, there was this meeting at the UN, and then meetings at places like Georgetown and I think Yale. I was away, I didn't have an opportunity to participate in the meeting at Yale or at Georgetown. So I don't know. There might be others in the audience who know more about me in terms of what's actually going on. I think it's generated a lot of enthusiasm, but my guess is that now we have to decide, are we going to slog it out with serious study and continued conversation? Or was this kind of just, in the end, a nice soundbite for a little while for kind of raising consciousness, but, you know, kind of, I would like to see it move to other, I mean, I guess it's met in Cambridge, Yale, so New Haven, or maybe it was Princeton, and then DC. And the leaders in Morocco had no idea about it. I would like to see it take place in a place like Morocco. I'd like to see it, because I think, you know, as I described my experience with my Moroccan students, I think they'd be very, very excited, enthusiastic to see what it, you know. And so I think it needs another shot in the arm. Again, this is from someone who's observing it from out. I need to be in active relation with Common Word, perhaps, to know it better. But my sense is it needs a kind of a little shot.
And I was at the conference at Georgetown, and that is what it ended up happening at the end. Many people had the question, where do we go from here? What is going to happen now? How can we bring this actually to the people?
Yeah.
This was, and it's apparently there are some congregations that have the Common Word document, you know, in their hymnals and in the pews, and so it is getting out, and a lot of the leadership didn't know this. So people have kind of taken it upon themselves to distribute the literature, but I think that where it needs to go is to the masses and to smaller venues of maybe workshops and seminars. But this was discussed, and I know that they did have a meeting about this after the conference, and so it would be exciting to see what comes out of that. Dr. Esposito said that a lot was done and said at that time.
Right, yeah, because I think it's vitally urgent, you know, at the level of the masses, as you said. I'm a consultant for what's called the Center for Interfaith Action that's run out of the National Cathedral, and they've got this program in Nigeria, Muslims and Christians working together, but they've kind of had some bumps along the way, and they've faced some blocks in terms of understanding theological grounding for interfaith action. They're working with the poor, and like for one health project they have is getting malaria nets out to people, and so I think the Common Word needs to continue at that deeper level, because it will have tremendous impact. I think Muslims and Christians, we really need to get to a point where we can trust each other. And I think ultimately that'll come when we see that we worship the same God. But that's going to take a lot of work, and I think the Common Word is kind of the first kind of consciousness raising, kind of the soundbite to kind of point us in this direction. But I know that there's some exciting possibilities just waiting to happen if this kind of continues on.
I would like to ask a question, or go back to what you began with on two levels, looking at first the concept of love, and then also looking at knowledge of religion, and how these two, I don't know if I want to say ideologies, but areas can come into the norm, can be normalized in a public setting, instead of seeing it as, instead of seeing it as kind of a private situation. I mean, we have there's a lot that the religions have to offer in terms of beliefs and belief systems have to offer in terms of betterment of society. I was just lucky enough to go to Brookings last week, and I heard Jim Wallace speak about a new book that he has out about values and the economy. And it's just, I think, something that definitely parts of our government struggle with because of the separation of church and state and how to grapple with this. And I'm wondering if your book could be a resource for people in terms of coming to grips with this, in terms of normalizing talking about religion like we talk about culture and race.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I don't quite have an answer for at this moment, because I meet a lot of opposition too, and I always have to check my language when I go to certain conferences. It's odd that you wouldn't have complete freedom. I mean, isn't it in scholarly circles that you're supposed to have complete freedom? And not to say that there isn't freedom, but I think, because of perhaps ways that people used limited, maybe, understandings of religion in the past have kind of continued to raise red flags in a healthy way for many scholars that they, but I guess all I would say is that that study that you mentioned by Jim Wallace, and I think there is enough suggestive data out there to show that you can't really know something unless you love it. I mean, we use that when we talk about relationship between husband and wife. I mean, somehow they know each other more deeply when they realize how deeply they love each other, and also with God. I mean, this is also, again, kind of an ancient mystical notion that you can only really know God when you love God. So I guess it's going to be a long process, but I think just a couple of cases that I gave, my student here and then my example in Morocco, I think it's just going to be enough examples that show that there's always something missing if I'm not in active relation. Let me give an example. Last year in Morocco, I invited 5 American students. They'd all recently finished their BA. They were in Morocco studying Arabic. And I invited them one day to come to class so that they could have a discussion with the students. And some of these American students, 5, had studied religion and had studied Islam. They were completely unprepared for what they faced. They were completely unprepared to meet what they faced in those Moroccan students. Not that they didn't think that they could have a conversation, it kind of came out eventually. But these are American students who've studied religion, and yet when they were placed before people whose societies they've studied, they didn't know how to engage. And so there's something askew in the studies that they've pursued. If the studies they pursue leave them unprepared to connect with the very people that they've studied, whose traditions they've studied, there's something wrong there. It was an amazing kind of eye of the hurricane experience where, for both sides, also the Moroccan students, who by then we had studied some examples of religion in American society and so on and so forth, and also for them, they were amazed. And yet they were both fascinated that once they came together, they could have a discussion. But that is like first-class evidence that there's something flawed in the definition of knowledge in the modern university, at least when it comes to religion. If you put up a bunch of people who've studied religion, and they're not prepared, that's a flaming factoid, as some people would call it. So.
Okay. Yeah, they all just went up at once. Okay. Okay, sir?
Very interesting conversation. I appreciate your taking the time to come speak with us. My name's Al Gombas. I'm from the State Department. As somebody who engages with Muslims, particularly from the Middle East and North Africa, I'm particularly interested to hear your critique of, or your observations about how we don't do a very good job of communicating with each other. You related to us how the dynamic sort of changed in your class in Morocco, and how your students responded to whatever it was that you told them. So I want to move beyond the critique that you presented to us and ask, what is the methodology, the pedagogy, the techniques that you used in that class that were effective? Can you give some examples perhaps of things that you did with your students that we could use when we engage with people from other faiths like that?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how the State Department works. I've had contact with people in the State Department, and I think a lot of good things go on there. A few years back, an Iranian intellectual who was visiting at Georgetown, Abdul Karim Saroush, and I gave a presentation together. I think John, my friend, was there. He could vouch for me. And we talked a little bit about the concept of friendship as a potentially diplomatic strategy. I mean, when I go and do research of Muslims, I just hang out with them and become friends with them, and it's amazing the information that comes, as opposed to some colleagues I have who I think they go there and just want to do the quick interview and get out, get the facts, and leave. A close college buddy of mine who's heading the investigation team in Pakistan for the Bhutto assassination tells me something similar. You know, great things happen when you work within a framework of friendship. I think there's sometimes a concern that, oh, we'll lose our diplomatic objectives if we become friends. And in fact, I think you'll gain. You'll gain. It's a tricky thing because State Departments, whether here or in other countries, are huge organizations that have their own internal momentum. And I'm partly speaking out of an ideal, but it's an ideal that works. I mean, in terms of my college buddy Milbert, in terms of my own experiences when I do research, it's in that context of friendship that I think great things can happen. Let me give you a further idea of that. Back in Morocco, a lot of the students I was teaching were of a Salafi mindset. Ibn Taymiyyah is it, okay? But that doesn't mean that they're kind of set in their way. I mean, there's something really beautiful in Islam, the idea of convincing knowledge, right? Whatever mindset you are, this idea of knowledge is so deep in Islam that if it's convincing, they'll accept it. But in any event, I was part of my course was teaching on developments in American religious society and the concept of religious freedom, the First Amendment. And you know, I showed them how that was really a religious construct in the first place. Some people think of religious freedom as a secular construct, but it was really the Baptist, our Baptist brothers and sisters, who pushed for that idea. They felt that their own particular kind of experience could never be regulated by a political establishment. And it was a great insight that they have and that they've given to the rest of us, including Muslims now in this country who don't feel they have to divide their loyalties between their religion and their nation. But, you know, occasionally one guy at the embassy would ask me, you know, are you teaching the First Amendment? And I'm like, yes, I'm teaching the First Amendment, you know. And also more deeply, I'm teaching deeper understandings of freedom. Freedom, I'm actually hoping to do a project on the concept of freedom as a potential source of conflict between Muslims and Christians, because, you know, is freedom an end? Right? American history has kind of got to a point where freedom is the ultimate purpose of life. For my students and for other cultures, no, freedom is not the ultimate purpose of life. Freedom is a means to an end. You know, so there are different kinds of questions of freedom out there. And so we had an amazing discussion. I mean, I translated, you know, the trial of Anne Hutchinson. And maybe some of you remember early Puritan America. She resisted, you know, she was led by the Spirit to decide how she was going to worship. You know, and we discussed that. And, you know, we discussed Amos Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and we discussed it all. And we discussed some of the letters of John Paul II, his understandings of freedom. And we discussed all these things, but also alongside concepts of freedom in Islam. We read, you know, some of the classics, Ibn Khaldun and Al-Qushayri and Muhammad Abdu, some of the great thinkers in Islam who've made some extraordinary statements on freedom. So, I think if I had just said, okay, guys, we need to do the First Amendment again, and I would have gotten nowhere. And, I'm not suggesting that this guy that I knew from the embassy was really, but, there's a concern among my students in Morocco that U.S. embassies in the world have an agenda that they're pushing, and religious freedom is one of them. Why? Why? Okay, I don't know. All the people I've met in the State Department are great people, but there's this perception. But in any event, after that experience, we spent the whole second semester almost talking about freedom of various kinds. Now, one of my students, Rashid, he's now preparing a doctorate on the concept of freedom in Islam. Now, I can only think that that's going to be tremendous ground for further connections between State Department people and other people, Muslims, as that gets discussed. But there's no kind of set bar in advance, or, let me go in there and do my thing and then get out. It's and I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know how the State Department works. Sometimes I feel that they circle their guys around quickly, maybe too quickly. I don't know. But that's just one idea. I mean, if you want to offer some suggestions, but I just say that it might be more difficult for State Department people to do what I did. Maybe it's the scholars have to do that, and that the scholars can mediate a little bit between some of the groups that I've worked with, and then with embassy people. I mean, that was the great invitation for the embassy in Morocco. They were ready to open up the embassy for my students, which would have been extraordinary. Now, unfortunately, because of security precautions, they have to take the names and IDs of all the students. And in a place like Morocco, that's just not going to happen. It was a wonderful gesture, though. It was a wonderful gesture. When I told the students that the embassy was ready to, they were amazed, It was a wonderful gesture. So maybe it's scholars. And, my experience in Morocco wasn't just a one-time thing. I'm trying to incorporate it in terms of the work I do here. And I think, because we need to go both ways. And so I've got a project where what I did the past year in Morocco, I'm trying to package it as an intensive summer program in Morocco, and maybe expand it to other educational sites in the Arab world. And so maybe it'll be like a triangular relation where you have kind of officials, whether U.S. or local, and then various groups and scholars. So I hope that gives some thoughts.
Okay. We have very little time left.
I'm sorry.
So if you, no, Paul. That's okay. It's very important what you're saying. If you can be as concise, as quick as possible, so because I want you to ask your question. So, so we have another one.
I'm deeply impressed with your presentation. Thank you. I want to say, though, as I'm listening to you talking, for some reason or another, I have easy conversations with Christians. I happen to be Muslim. Okay. But it seems to me that your presentation is being directed to the uninvited guests, which is secularists. Okay. What is knowledge? How is knowledge applied? Yeah. Now, this might be because I'm affected by George Collin, who just said that religion is bull, and not knowledge.
Right.
So is that a false perception on my part?
No, not at all. That's true. I mean, the world that I work in, the world where I get my legitimacy, right? We all are concerned about how we're legitimate, whether it's political legitimacy or scholarly legitimacy, what we do. Religious leaders have their legitimacy, so on and so forth. But yes, it is coming out of that, absolutely. That's a fair insight, a very accurate insight. But on the other hand, I would say, though, that it has a plangency, it has a resonance. I mean, universities are where all types of people go, and so while it is a kind of a battle that I have mainly with some of my peers, not all of them, and my peers who are more secularist have their great insights too, but I just think, and I don't think we should block them out, or, I think we just need a new niche, as it were. But I guess what I would say is that you have just thousands and thousands of students who come through a place like Georgetown or other universities who get deeply affected by one or the other. When I was an undergraduate at a small college in Cambridge by the name of Harvard, my teachers went in there to bust your faith. I think that's a problem. You know, not to say that it's unhealthy, a kind of critical kind of engagement. But yeah, so no, you're right. You're absolutely right. The academy is at an odd moment. But then there's this just, you know, the university has incredible effect on our societies and cultures. So, yeah.
I think it's important to remember that everybody can sit at the table.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. If we welcome in the concepts of love and knowledge of religion, it's not to exclude. It's not a either or situation, but that we can take from all of it and work together. Sam.
Well, I have the phone.
Oh, actually, I'm so sorry, NG.
That's
Thank
all
you
right.
so much. No, Ann, I'm so sorry.
Hi, I'm Ann Rutherford, and I was just wondering why, with the three major religions of the world that are related, why did you happen to exclude the Jewish religion in your book?
I just don't have expertise, you know. Let me read here the third paragraph. In principle, the study of Christianity and Islam through a single, albeit refracted lens should include Judaism. Every insight in this book can be enriched by bringing in the Jewish perspective. In a way, Judaism stands at the heart of both Christianity and Islam. It has a strong sense of the messianic promise and a strong commitment to religious ethics. The common ground is ultimately tripartite. However, every study has its limits. And so there I go into my limits. I grew up in an entirely Jewish neighborhood. I thought I was Jewish until the age of 13 when my mother told me I couldn't have a bar mitzvah. Newton, suburb of Boston. I didn't study it though. I just don't have the scholarly expertise. And so if I'm going to be more than just, let's talk about, if this is going to be really kind of rooted in critical knowledge and that type of thing, I have to be trained in it. And I don't have that training in Judaism. And so I suggest that other scholars who do can take this up, or maybe someday I'll familiarize myself more with it, but at the moment that's my limitation. So.
Fair enough. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today for this luncheon forum. And FYI, out in the reception area, you can purchase this book, and check, cash, or credit card is taken. It's $18, discounted price. And I highly recommend that you purchase. This has been a wonderful discussion today. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.